The Siege of Jerusalem, the city that ate itself. In the spring of 70 AD, 4 Roman legions under Titus encircled the walls of the Holy City, trapping over 600,000 people inside. With no warning, no harvest stored, and nowhere left to run. The disaster began with the Jews themselves. 3 rival factions had been fighting inside the walls for years, and when the Romans arrived, the leaders ordered their own grain stores burned to force every man to take up arms. Months of food turned to ash in a single night. Titus did not need to assault the walls. He built a wooden palisade around the entire city, nearly 5 miles long, sealing every road and every shepherd's path. Nothing entered, and the Romans simply waited as Jerusalem turned in on itself behind the stones. Within weeks, the markets were empty. A single loaf of bread cost a man his life savings, and families traded gold rings for handfuls of grain. The wealthy hid food in cisterns beneath their houses, and armed gangs roamed the alleys searching every cellar and roof. When the grain ran out, they ate leather. Belts were boiled until soft, then chewed for hours to break down the fibers. Sandals followed, then the leather covers from old shields. Josephus wrote that hay from horse stables was sold for gold by the handful. The animals went next. Horses, mules, and donkeys were slaughtered first, then the dogs of the streets. Even rats from the sewers were hunted at night by torchlight. By midsummer, no living creature larger than an insect could still be found inside the city walls. The armed factions searched every home. They beat fathers and mothers to make children reveal the family's last hidden grain. Anyone too healthy-looking was tortured on suspicion of secret food, because in a starving city, a full belly was the loudest possible confession. The worst account comes from Josephus. A noblewoman named Mary of Bethzuba, driven mad by hunger, killed and roasted her own infant son, then ate half. When soldiers smelled the meat and broke down her door, she offered them the rest. They fled in horror at what they had found. Bodies piled up faster than anyone could bury them. The factions threw the dead over the walls to clear the streets, and the Romans counted the corpses as they landed in the ravines below. Titus saw the scale of the dying and is said to have raised his hands toward heaven. Some tried to escape through the lines. The wealthiest swallowed their gold coins before slipping over the walls at night, hoping to retrieve them once safe in the Roman camp. The trick worked for a while, and a handful of merchants reached Antioch with their fortunes still inside them. Then the Romans discovered the gold. Auxiliary soldiers began slitting open every refugee found near the camp, searching their stomachs for swallowed coins. Titus ordered the practice stopped, but by then thousands of escapees had already been cut down for the gold inside them. The captured refugees were crucified. 500 a day were nailed to crosses on the hills around the city, in plain view of the defenders on the walls. Josephus wrote that the Romans ran out of wood for crosses, and out of space on the hills to set them up. The walls finally broke in August. Roman legionaries poured through the breach into a city of corpses, and the survivors were too weak to even raise a sword. The temple itself burned that same day, and the fires were said to have lit the night sky for many miles around. Josephus claimed over 1 million people died inside Jerusalem, mostly from hunger. The siege ended one of the largest cities of the ancient world, and the survivors were sold as slaves across the empire. A famine inside one set of walls had broken a kingdom that Rome had not. Hey, if you've made it this far, you're my kind of person. Hit subscribe and I'll keep the stories coming. Sokushinbutsu, the living mummies of Japan. In the mountains of northern Japan, a small group of Shingon Buddhist monks chose a death so extreme that it would take nearly 9 years to complete, a deliberate starvation that turned their own bodies into sacred relics. The practice came from a 9th century monk named Kukai. He taught that perfect enlightenment could be reached only by leaving the body behind in a state of pure meditation. His followers in Yamagata spent the next 1,000 years trying to do exactly that, one slow step at a time. The first phase was 1,000 days of training. The monk gave up all rice, wheat, and barley, eating only nuts, seeds, and berries gathered from the mountain forests. He spent his days hauling water and chopping wood, burning every ounce of body fat off his frame. After 3 years, the body changed. The monk's stomach had shrunk to a fraction of its old size. His muscles were lean and stringy, and every layer of fat had melted away. He could go for days on a handful of pine nuts and a cup of stream water without feeling weak. The second phase began with a darker diet. For another 1,000 days, the monk ate only bark stripped from pine trees, roots dug from the soil, and the needles of mountain cedars. His teeth loosened, his hair thinned, and the skin on his hands cracked open from the cold. Then came the tea, brewed from the sap of the urushi tree, the same lacquer that coated samurai armor. The monk drank a small bitter cup every single day, knowing that the same substance was used to poison wood and would slowly take effect on his body from the inside. The urushi tea did its work from the inside. The monk vomited constantly, sweat poured from his skin, and his bowels emptied themselves over and over for weeks. Every drop of water in his body was driven out, and his organs began to harden into something almost dry. The toxin built up in his tissues. After months of daily doses, the monk's body was so saturated with urushi that no maggot, fly, or bacteria could survive on his flesh. He was preparing his own corpse to resist decay in a way no ordinary embalming could ever match. The final phase began at the tomb, where the monk was lowered into a stone pit barely larger than his body. He sat in lotus position with a small bronze bell in one hand, while a bamboo tube was set into the stone lid above him so he could breathe. The rest was sealed in stone. Every day at dawn, the monk rang the bell once. The sound traveled up through the bamboo tube to the temple floor above, telling his brothers that he was still meditating below. They waited above in silence, listening for the single chime that meant another day of breath. Then one morning the bell did not ring. The brothers waited a full day to be sure, then sealed the bamboo tube with a plug of clay. The tomb was left untouched for exactly 1,000 more days, while the monk's body remained in lotus position deep beneath the temple floor. On the 1,000th day, the brothers opened the tomb. Most monks they pulled out had simply decayed in the earth, and these failures were buried with respect but never honored. But a few corpses came out dry, preserved, and still seated, and these were declared Sokushinbutsu. The most famous success was Shinyokai Shonin. He completed the ritual at the age of 96 in 1783, and his preserved body still sits today at Dainichibu Temple in Yamagata. Pilgrims travel for many miles to see him, and his robes are changed every 6 years by the monks. The Japanese government banned the practice in 1879. Fewer than 30 Sokushinbutsu were ever confirmed, out of hundreds of monks who tried because most failed and rotted away in their tombs. The few who succeeded had starved their way into a state between life and a kind of holy death. The Siege of Numantia, Spain's final stand. In the year 133 BC, the small Celtiberian city of Numantia stood as the last free settlement in northern Spain, defying the Roman Republic after 20 years of broken legions and humiliated consuls sent home in disgrace. Numantia sat on a steep hilltop above the Duero River, defended by perhaps 4,000 warriors. The Celtiberians had crushed Roman army after Roman army for 2 decades, taking heads as trophies and sending one consul fleeing with his men under a yoke of crossed spears. Rome finally sent Scipio Aemilianus. He arrived with 60,000 soldiers and refused to fight in the open field, because he knew the Celtiberians would carve his men apart. Instead, he chose to surround the city completely and starve every warrior inside to death. Scipio's men built a ring of walls around the entire hill. The line stretched over 5 miles with 7 forts spaced along it, deep ditches in front and tall wooden towers every 100 feet. The Duero River downstream was blocked by a chain of logs studded with iron blades. Nothing could enter Numantia. No food, no messengers, no allies from the neighboring tribes who might have brought relief. Scipio settled in for as long as it took, and his 60,000 soldiers ate their daily rations while the 4,000 inside slowly weakened. Inside Numantia, the first winter passed in hunger. The Celtiberians killed their horses one by one, smoking the meat to last as long as it could. They ate their dogs next, then their pack mules, and finally the goats and chickens kept inside when the gates first closed. By spring, they were eating leather. Shield covers, sword belts, and harness straps were boiled in water until soft enough to chew. Old hides used as floor mats were torn into strips and shared among families. The leather kept hunger alive, but barely fed the body at all. Then they ate the dead. The Celtiberians began with the bodies of those killed in the fighting on the walls, and then those who had died of hunger inside their homes. The historian Appian wrote that the warriors who ate corpses were no longer fully human in the eyes of their own people. Then came the killing of the weak, when the sick and wounded who could no longer fight on the walls were given to the strongest warriors as food. Mothers were said to have killed their own children, and elders walked alone into the streets to be taken by their neighbors. Scipio waited and watched. His scouts reported skeletal figures moving along the walls at night, men too weak to draw a bow but still refusing to surrender. He ordered no assault and no parley because every day inside the walls did more damage than any Roman attack ever could. Some warriors chose poison over the Romans. They drank a brew made from a local plant and lay down to die together in groups inside their stone homes. Others fell on their own swords in the central square, while their families burned around them with the last of the city's oil. The siege lasted 8 months. When the gates finally opened in the summer of 133 BC, the warriors who walked out were unrecognizable. Their hair was matted with filth, their faces gaunt and dark, and their eyes were said to be like those of wolves dragged from a cave. Scipio took 50 prisoners for his triumph in Rome. The rest of the city was sold into slavery or killed on the spot, and the buildings were torn down to the foundations. The hill where Numantia had stood was left empty to remind every tribe in Spain what had happened there. Numantia became a legend across the Mediterranean. Cicero wrote of the city centuries later as the symbol of a free people who had chosen starvation over surrender. The 4,000 warriors had held off Rome for 20 years, and only their own hunger had finally broken them. The Anabasis, the March of 10,000. In 401 BC, a Greek mercenary army of 10,000 soldiers found itself stranded deep in the Persian Empire, 1,500 miles from home, with no supplies, no allies, and no road out except through enemy lands. They had been hired by Cyrus the Younger. The Persian prince paid them to march east and seize the throne from his brother Artaxerxes, and they crossed half a continent expecting one easy battle. At Cunaxa in Babylonia, Cyrus was killed in a single charge against his brother's line. The Persians offered the Greeks safe passage home. The generals of the army accepted the offer and rode out unarmed to negotiate the terms in person. They were seized at the dinner table by the Persian commander Tissaphernes, and beheaded one by one in the camp of the king. The army was leaderless overnight. The senior officers were dead, the food was gone within days, and Persian cavalry was already gathering on every horizon. A young Athenian writer named Xenophon stood up that night and convinced the troops to elect new generals on the spot. The plan was to march north. Going home south or west meant crossing the open plains of Mesopotamia, where Persian cavalry would destroy them in a single afternoon. Their only chance was the mountains of Armenia, then somehow over the high passes to the distant Black Sea coast. They started the long march under attack. Persian cavalry circled the column day after day, raining arrows from a safe distance and burning the villages ahead so no food could be taken from them. The Greeks improvised a small unit of slingers to drive the riders back. The first great obstacle was the Tigris. The Greeks crossed it on inflated animal skins tied together with rope, then turned northward into the foothills of the Carducci tribesmen. The Carducci had killed every Persian army that ever entered their valleys, and now they came for the Greeks. Then the snow began. The army marched into the mountains of Armenia in November, climbing passes 7,000 feet above sea level. Snow fell 6 feet deep in a single night, and men who lay down to sleep at the wrong moment never stood up again in the morning. Frostbite took fingers and toes. Soldiers stripped boots from the dead and wrapped their feet in raw hides cut from slaughtered oxen, the only way to keep walking on the ice. Snow blindness left many marching with eyes closed, holding the spear shaft of the man in front of them. The food was almost gone. The Greeks dug for buried grain in the floors of Armenian villages, finding sealed clay jars hidden under stone slabs and full of barley. They ate the boiled barley with handfuls of snow, and sometimes raw onions left frozen in the abandoned gardens. Hostile tribes attacked at every pass. The Taochi rolled boulders down narrow tracks to crush the column, and the Chalabes met them with sharp iron weapons in close combat. Whole villages threw themselves off cliffs rather than be taken alive when the Greeks reached their walls. Then one morning in February, the men at the front of the column began shouting a single word over and over. Xenophon rode forward at a gallop, thinking another army had appeared, but he found his men weeping on a ridge and pointing towards something far below them on the horizon. The shout was Thalata, the Greek word for the sea. The cry passed back down the column for many miles, and men who had not wept in months fell to their knees on the snow. They had reached the Black Sea after 5 months and nearly 1,500 miles since Cunaxa was lost. 6,000 soldiers reached Trapezus alive, less than 2/3 of the original 10,000. Xenophon later wrote the entire story in a book called the Anabasis, and Greek generals were still studying it 2,000 years later as a textbook on how to bring an army home. If you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button for more. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and see you in the next one.